I really needed this after making the last few pieces. This was insanely easy and insanely therapeutic. I built this over 2-3 nights. Insanely easy build. I built it simultaneously with the sword. I would have done the sword video first, but it still needs the handle finished, and I'm waiting on some molds to dry before I wrap that up. So it will be the next video. Just like everything else so far in the series, it's not finished. It's in a state that's close to finished, where, you know, a couple more details and then clean up, and I'll take it out and paint it. If you notice this so far in the rest of the series, none of the pieces are done yet. I'm building everything up to a certain point and then just stopping and then building something else. My main goal is to get everything to a similar level. That way I can start detailing everything all at once. Main reason, this is all on a deadline. I have about a month left to build all this, maybe a little less than a month, like 3.5 weeks. And I want the quality to be consistent across every piece. So get everything built, get it all fitted properly, and then after that I'll start detailing everything on an even level. And I know at a certain point, you know, when I got to do painting and sewing and all that other stuff, I know that, okay, detailing has to stop here, start prime and paint here, you know, that way everything gets done and I can stretch out the most quality as I can within that time period. Is it the best that I'm going to be able to do? No, but it'll at least hopefully get done. Hopefully. So, like I said, today we're talking about the bolter, the BoltGun. As far as scaling on this goes, it's scaled to this little guy. This is the toy weapon for this action figure here, which I am basing my entire costume around. Black Templar Sword Brethren. The figure is from Joy Toy. They have a whole collection of really cool Warhammer figures, but for some reason that one in particular stuck out to me and I had to make it. So first bit I don't have any footage for because I actually did it at work. So what I had done was I need to take measurements from this figure and scale them up, just to make a gun template. If you've looked around online before, you've probably seen gun templates and weapon templates all before, and it's usually just a profile image of the weapon. I've never used any of theirs or seen how anyone else actually does this, so I might be doing this way wrong or just way weird. But anyway, instead of looking around online for one, which I'm sure they're probably readily available, I'm sure there's probably dozens of these out there, but I wanted it to scale how I wanted, so I was bored at work, so I did this myself at work. What I did was I brought this little guy with me to work, and I just took a ruler and I figured out a scaling measurement that I wanted. So my suit's going to be about 6.5 feet tall and the figure's 5 inches. So I did some rough estimates to figure out like what I needed to multiply or divide everything by to do the math. I went to do the same exact thing with this, but my math turned out a lot easier when I realized that if I measured this little guy out in millimeters and then just divided it in half, that was how many inches I needed to make this thing. So if I remember right, basically I think it was like 2 millimeters for every inch. So let's say this thing here is in total, well, without the barrel, it's about 40 inches. So this thing here in the template, yeah, I mean this ruler only goes to 18, but 2 more inches would get this thing to 20 from back end to the front of the gun, not counting the barrel. So it was a very easy, like 2-to-1 measure. So it was insanely easy. I just took a ruler at work, got a couple pieces of paper out of the printer, taped them together, and just started making a whole thing. Every little bit of downtime I had, I just took the ruler out, measured this out, measured that out. I made 3 pieces. I made side profile, front profile, and back profile. The reason I did it was because in case there was anything I could not see from the front or back, I could make sure I got everything lined up properly. That would be like the placement and scaling of the barrels on the gun, how far out the handle stuck and all that stuff. So once I got all that done, now we actually do have B-roll. So we'll play along and I will talk about whatever comes to mind, just like always. All right, so the moment I brought it home, I started cutting everything out. All the excess stuff, or what I wouldn't need. Cut the barrels off first because they weren't gonna be needed till very last. And then I started cutting out all the individual pieces. The way this was going to work was I was more or less just going to cut layers and layers of foam and then just layer it, you know, deepest stuff in, work my way out to the surface. I started with the most inner piece, which would have been, if I remember right, 4 pieces. Yeah, the innermost pieces would have been 4 pieces. I'm using 12mm sheet foam. I think when I did my side profiles, I kind of measured out to make it to that. I might have actually made it to 1/2 inch scale. So in the end, the sword's a little more narrow than it should have been, but it looks fine. It's maybe narrow by like 1/4 inch on both sides, so it's nothing terrible. So anyway, after I cut out the very first piece, I needed to make 3 more. So I just laid down a huge sheet on my spare table and just started cutting everything out. I used the first piece as kind of like a master template, so I could hopefully try and keep them semi-consistent. Spoiler alert, didn't work that well. But then, yeah, cut the rest of the details out for those 4. And then started gluing them all together. This ended up using a ton of contact cement. Like an absolute ton. Start with the 2 innermost first. Let them dry, glue them together, then started working on the outer ones. And then after I had put the 2 center together, glued the sides of that, waited for them to dry, and then applied all 4. That way I had 4 sheets of 12mm foam as my base core down the center. I did not use anything to reinforce it in the center, and that's mostly because the foam is 12mm, and you put those 4 pieces together, it does not wobble, like, at all. Like, this thing's sturdy. If I was making like a prop sword or something like that, that'd be a whole different story. You'd want something in there to kind of stiffen it up, but this is more or less just a solid block of foam, so it's got all the structural integrity it needs. All right, so after I had those 4 all together, I had to figure out what was going to be in the next layer. That was another reason I had my front and back profile pictures that I had drawn, because I had them divided up as well, so I could see what was in the center and then what was in each layer outward. So on the template, I'd cut out the handle, and I think that was it, just the handle. Yeah, and then from there, I had to work on my next layer out. So I used my front and back profile where I could see, where I had kind of laid out what would be in what layers going out from the center. So in this next layer, I had to cut the handle out because then the handle was already part of the core. Everything else was sticking out past it. So it would have been the barrel, the handle, and the magazine. And I traced that all out to foam, cut it all out as well. This would have been just 1 layer on each side. Again, went crazy with the contact cement, and then laid that down. I also the bottom portion of the magazine, I did that separate because there's a recessed bit in the side. From there, I started doing some cleanup. Not everything was going to line up perfect, so I took a blade and started trying to cut out some of the high points. After that, then I needed to work on the bevel of the handle. So I took the handle part of the template that I had cut out and kind of just free-handed where I thought the high point would have been, traced that out, and then started carving along that line. I think I only took it in, I think 1 sheet. I went from the line that I'd drawn and then carved it to the innermost part of the first sheet. That way I knew it was going to be consistent on both sides. I did the same thing for the handle as well. This would end up eventually getting wrapped by the next layer for the grading on the handle, but the recess bit is also beveled, so I figured I'd get this as well. I did the same thing. I measured out how high I needed it to be, which I think it was like an inch, maybe about an inch, 3/4 of an inch, somewhere around there. And then made sure that when I cut it with the blade, I cut it along that line down to the very bottom of the first layer. That way it was consistent both left and right. And before I went on to the next layer, I knew once I put the next layer on, there was going to be a lot of overlap, especially with the grading. So this had been the best time for me to get the Dremel out and start smoothing things as best I could. So I went to town on the whole thing, every edge I could find, every bevel I'd cut, everything I could do to try and smooth it out some. Still not 100% perfect, but it was enough to get it in a state that I could work on the next phase. When you can never skip out on your Dremels. This allowed me to get the handle a lot smoother as well. That way it wasn't just a straight 45 on both sides. It was nice and round now. Did my best to try and bevel out the trigger on the gun too. I originally wasn't going to add the trigger at all, but I figured it would probably help hold some structure to it as well, so I kept it in. I figure when I go to hold the gun, I can just have my index finger facing out instead of wrapping around it. And then from there, I knew my line wasn't completely straight on the top. As much as I tried carving and dremeling the entire top, it wasn't 100% smooth. So what I did was I just took a real thin sheet of like 5mm foam and traced it to the top, and then just glued that on top. It makes it a lot smoother. What little imperfections kind of got smoothed out along the way as that piece lays across the top. But from there came time to do the outermost details. The grading was a little tricky, just because it required a lot of measuring to figure out. I had drawn, I think on the template, I drew the grading on the bottom, but I didn't draw it on the top. And even on the figure, they're spaced different and their size different. So I just did some more guesswork to try and find something that worked. And then I, cut those pieces out. And I had to make a template for the other side because both the inner and outer are slightly different. One actually has the actual like ejection slide for the bullets, and then the other side's just solid. So I had to kind of like rework my old template for the one side for the other side. But I think that's the only major change from left to right. So I didn't make a left and right profile. I just figured I could always, after I made the one piece, I could just take the template, modify it, and have my other side. But once I had them, before I glued them on, I needed to make the bevel as well. I kind of like lined them up side to side, made sure that my measurement and cuts were going to be consistent the whole way across. And then I cut out the grading. And from there I realized I was going to need to angle the top as well, just like I had done the bottom. So I measured that out first. And then I used one more sheet of 5mm on the top. Yeah, eventually I think when I went to go cut the grading on the top, I cut it the whole way back down to the 12mm foam. And just like before, it's a lot easier to get the Dremel in these grooves before I applied it, so I hit them first before I put down any glue or anything to make sure that I got them this consistent. They were exactly as thick, or they were exactly as wide as the Dremel bit. So once the Dremel started being smooth where it could fit the whole way through, I knew I was good. And I didn't go any farther than that afterwards. Then once I had the top piece and the side pieces glued on, then I had to make that 45 angle on the sides. So I kind of figured out real quick just by grabbing some scrap foam and figuring out how much of a gap I had. I did my best when I made both the top piece and the side pieces, that straight edge was as consistent as possible, because when I go to fill this gap in, it was going to have to be consistent the whole way, which was going to be insanely tricky. I used 5mm because I think I originally had tried using 12 and it was just way too thick. 5 worked really good, and even though I gave the two corners 45s, I still had to kind of like carve a little extra out of them, making it almost like a slight bevel to get them to really actually stick the whole way down without popping up too much. but I didn't cut out the grating on them until after I had glued them on. That way I could line up the lines from the top grating to the side grating evenly. Once I put them on, made sure I pressed everything down as tight as I could. Tried cutting off or cut off any excess that was still sticking up a little bit. This would all get cleaned up with a Dremel anyway. And then yeah, I just kind of like did my best to match up the lines from the top and the side. Didn't have any issues with it, thankfully. Once I got that done, it was time to do some like basic details. So I did the little bullet slider on the side. I cut that out. I completely forgot to cut that out beforehand, which was my bad. And then gave everything another round of dremeling. Caught all the high points, made sure anything that was sticking up was now flush. And once I was done with the top half, came time for the bottom half, which would have been the handle, or the, I don't know if that even, probably not, I don't know. Just made two square blocks to start, and then traced out the grating after I'd cut the 2 blocks out, and then gave everything a glue except for the parts that I had cut. I intentionally left them in this time, the gratings that I had cut. I left them in the pieces this time, specifically because of how long they were, that if I had taken them all out and tried to apply it, there might have been some inconsistencies on how each piece would have been hanging. So I knew this would keep everything separated perfectly. So after I glued them on, pressed them on, then afterwards I peeled each one off individually. And then from there it was the same exact process as I did on the top. I took a piece of 12mm foam, put it on the bottom, had it match up the center as I could, marked the grating on that, cut that out, then made my corner pieces. Those two, the bottom ones are actually 10mm. Why I didn't use 12, I don't know, but 10 worked fine. Maybe I had more scrap 10 laying around, and I don't want to waste my 12s because that's expensive. But yeah, anyway, same thing with the top corners. Once they were done, lined up my cuts between the side grating and the bottom gratings, cut all them out and pulled them right out. And then came time for more side detailing. This time would have been like the circles in the back of the handle, stuff like that, and like the little squares on the magazine. And before I applied them, I got all the edges with the Dremel to smooth everything out. A lot easier to get a small piece like that before gluing it on. And that pretty much got the entire base structure of the gun done. After that, it just came time to do the front, the barrels and stuff. Now, just like the top, from all those sheets of foam I'd cut, everything was still slightly inconsistent from piece to piece. So best way to cover all that up was just take a whole thin sheet of 5mm foam and just make a copy of it, trace that out, cut it out, glue it on. I waited to glue it on though till the end though, because I figured I would make the barrels recessed inside of that. That way it'd kind of help hold them a little better. Then I used my front template that I had made to try and get an idea of the height of everything that I wanted. I think this was around the time that I ended up realizing that everything was going to be too fat, or the main barrel was going to be too fat, and I had to make a new one, which was fine because I screwed up the first barrel anyway. So once I made the new barrel, the second attempt at the barrel, I needed to find the center so I could make the holes in the side of it, the hole vent thing. But anyway, yeah, I found out the center for both sides, and then figured out a decent sized circle to cut out. And yeah, so when I cut out the holes in the front piece, I saved the cutouts because I wanted to take the innermost part and then stick that inside of the barrels. That way that they'd kind of like help hold the whole thing. That way is not only was it glued up to the front of the gun, but it also wrapped around both the outside and the inside, so the barrel would never ever get pulled out. I think the barrel would rip before it actually pulls out. Anyway, after that, glued that all on, and then came time to Dremel again. Found any kind of inconsistencies between the front piece and the rest of the gun, smoothed out the whole in the barrel. Got the gratings on the bottom as well. Did everything I could just to find anything that was inconsistent that I could reach with the Dremel, smooth it out. After that, the only thing left to do was the sights on the top. I did no math whatsoever for this. I just did a bunch of guesswork. Whatever looked right to me, I was like, well, okay, it starts here, ends here. Made a measurement and then rounded it off to the nearest inch. Cut that out. Glued them on, finished her all up. It's an insanely quick video, an insanely quick build, insanely easy. I would say if you're someone who like is getting into prop making or craft making and stuff, seriously, stuff like this is probably the easiest thing to get into to make. It's, I don't even know how to describe just how easy it is, because you're just layering. That's really all you're doing, you know. You get to learn some of your basic fundamentals of how you work with your glue and all that stuff, and if you do it right, it's not even that insanely expensive to make one of these. Well, I don't know. But yep, that is the gun. Let's see, is there anything I else need to talk about the gun while I'm here? There's still some minor cleanup to do. I want to round some edges off, but for the most part, I don't feel like I need to touch a whole lot. This is actually pretty cool. So, like in my last video, I had mentioned that I was making my sword. The sword is now done. Well, not done. Still has a handle that I have to do. But I had said that these were going to drive me nuts. These were also insanely easy to do, and I didn't have a problem with them either. But that is a subject for another video, which will be the next video. So, until then, I don't have any kind of fancy slogans or anything like that, so just go away.